Hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. It is April 29th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today?
I am Bob Palmer, here in Gainesville, Florida.
Fantastic. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Palmer. So if you can begin by telling me a little bit about who you are and what your position is.
Well, I'm retired.
All right.
Happy to be retired. My wife and I moved to Gainesville 17 years ago. She got a job as a professor here at UF, and I've been retired. Previously, I did all sorts of things when I was your age. I worked in the inner city. I worked on an Indian reservation. I was a private detective. All sorts of things. Somewhere along the line, I got serious and I got a PhD in marine biology. And from there, I ended up in a fellowship on Capitol Hill in Washington. So I worked for a committee in the U.S. House. I was staff director of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the U.S. House for many years. Worked in the Congress for almost 30 years, and before I came down here. So I have some scientific background, but I also have, extensive policy, legal background. I'm not an attorney. We'll probably talk about a lot of legal stuff here. I'm not an attorney, but I've worked with lawyers, I've written laws, I've studied laws for many, many years, both in Washington and down here.
So yeah, you do have an interesting background. You have your bachelor's in psychology, your master's, and I think your master's in biology, your PhD in marine biology. How did you end up with all that kind of stuff? End up working for Florida Springs and as a staff director in DC.
Well, in DC, it's the largest scientific society in the country, AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. They publish Science magazine and do a lot of other things. But they have a fellowship program that sends postdoctoral individuals up, or initially in the 70s, up to Capitol Hill. It's since broadened. They send people all over Washington, but apparently the dog doesn't like Washington. But I got a fellowship from AAAS to go work on Capitol Hill, and that was in the 1970s. That's how I ended up there. And I kind of stuck. I liked it and stayed for a long time. And then down here, I was retired, as I said. I guess sort of an interesting way into water and springs issues. I was looking around for things to do. I didn't really know anybody here. Literally moved here, didn't know anybody. My wife did because she had the professorship. But I ended up serving on something called EPAC, which is the Environmental Protection Advisory Committee, EPAC, and it's a committee that advises the Alachua County Commission. Alachua County has lots of citizens advisory committees, and this is the one that deals with the environment. So I got on that many years ago and ended up chairing that as well. But that's when I first got exposed to water issues. I met Dr. Knight. In fact, we invited him to give a presentation to this advisory committee. There's an interesting story. It's not springs related, but you'd probably be interested in hearing it. Did you know that there's a Superfund site in Gainesville?
A couple of them.
Copper's Superfund site?
Yeah, a big one.
It's up on 8th Avenue. And they use creosote and other nasty chemicals to treat poles, utility poles and so forth. And there's a lot of contamination in the ground. There's a lot of contamination that seeped into the aquifer. I started getting involved in this issue when I was serving on EPAC. And it's probably the first time I sort of became aware that we're sitting over an aquifer, because a lot of that old pollution going back 100 or more years was seeping into the aquifer, and it was actually moving toward the well field. There's a well field in North Gainesville, the Murphy well field, where we all get our water. GRU gets their water. And this contamination there was a plume of it that was slowly moving in that direction. Very concerning to 10, 12, 15 years ago to everybody in this town. And so I got involved in that. I became aware of the aquifer, water issues. Interestingly, that site is shut down now. They're no longer producing utility poles. But back when I got involved in the issue, they were, and they had shifted off creosote, but they were using a chemical called CCA, which is copper chromium arsenate. That sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Chromium arsenic, not good stuff, but that's what they soaked the poles in. And that stuff was, you know, there were probably better practices 10 years ago than there were 100 years ago, but some of that stuff was still leaching into the ground. So I went to a briefing one day and was talking to the industry rep, and I said, why don't you use more benign chemicals than this CCA? There are alternatives that aren't as bad. You know, you used to be able to go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy treated wood that was treated with CCA, and people made swing sets for their kids out of it, sawdust everywhere, and then EPA banned it for household use, which was good, but they never banned it in places like Koppers, which were producing the poles. So I talked to this guy who ran the facility, and he said, well, we don't have to use CCA. If our customers want something safer, we can do it. It's just more expensive. Well, who are your customers? He said, well, Florida Power and Light, GRU, the Gainesville Utility, City of Alachua. So I went to the county commission, got them to send letters to the customers saying, why don't you guys use a different chemical? Koppers can produce it for you. I also went to the city commission, which refused to do anything because they run GRU and they didn't want to, you know, ruffle any feathers. A bunch of op-eds followed in the Gainesville Sun, really embarrassing GRU, and I think, and embarrassing the city government, that the city government was supposedly very concerned about this plume of pollution moving toward their water source. At the same time, they were buying poles and subsidizing this business that was creating more of the same problem. So GRU was, I think, highly embarrassed. Interestingly, within 6 months after that campaign, they shut down the facility. They stopped. And I think it had something to do with us. I think the customers went to them and said, we don't want the CCA anymore, we're getting too much heat. They actually shut down the facility, which was great, because now they have an empty facility they can clean up, which they've been doing now for 6 or 8 years. And I think it's a much safer situation. So anyway, that's a long story. It doesn't have anything to do with springs, but it does have, you asked how I got involved. That's kind of how I got involved in water pollution and the aquifer. And while I was on that committee, I'd heard about Bob Knight. I invited him to give a presentation. Bob, I think, called me the next morning and said, I want you to be on my board of directors at the Springs Institute. You've interviewed Bob?
Yes, sir, yeah.
So Bob, as you know, founded the Florida Springs Institute, and he set up a board there, I guess, about 10 years ago, and I've been on that board for 10 years, or however long it's been since it started. And somewhere along the line, it's been about 5 or 6 years now, and I really have to credit Bob with this. You know, Bob's a scientist, he's an advocate. He was trying to do lobbying, you know. We would go up to Tallahassee, Bob and I, and lobby. That's not Bob's greatest strength. His greatest strength is the science and the communication. He's fabulous at both of those. He doesn't like the political process nearly as much. So I think we all recognized, and Bob particularly did, that the Springs Institute's a nonprofit dedicated to research, education, science. It really shouldn't be lobbying. Bob's going to continue to advocate, that's in his blood. But so we talked about it, and we decided that there are all these springs groups around the state. We should set up a consortium of these groups. And I really credit Bob really with the idea. And there was a meeting down in Silver Springs about 6, 7 years ago. Bob was there, I was there, Guy Marwick was there, I think Marilee Mulwitz-Gibson was there. There were only about 5 of us. And we said, yeah, let's start this thing. What are we going to call it? And so we convened a meeting, I think down at Prairie Creek Lodge here in Alachua County. And we decided to call it Florida Springs Council, and their function was going to be advocacy, lobbying, legal challenges, all things the Springs Institute really shouldn't be doing, was not their strength, and they really shouldn't be doing it. So we formed it. We didn't really have any money. And then a couple, 3 years into the Springs Council's existence, I was their de facto lobbyist. You know, I was the one going up to Tallahassee lobbying on behalf of the Springs groups that were in this coalition. I was there for the 2016 water bill, was very active in that. But I guess around 2018, we got a chunk of money and enough money to actually hire a director. And fortunately, we hired Ryan Smart, who's got more energy than any 12 people I know, is very effective, very smart, very passionate, and isn't afraid of anybody. You know, so he's the executive director. He's doing a great job, and that's what the council does. The council lobbies and is involved in legal challenges. And Ryan does 98% of the lobbying these days. He loves it. I go up with him occasionally, but I'm glad to be rid of that. Tallahassee is hard. It's a hard nut to crack. And I worked in, you know, the U.S. Congress for almost 30 years. I know what's involved, but Tallahassee is not the U.S. Congress. Well, I don't know what the U.S. Congress is anymore. I worked there in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts. It changed a lot during that time. It's changed for the worse since. But, you know, my experience, U.S. Congress is a far more serious legislative, deliberative oversight body than the Florida legislature. Florida legislature to me is minor league, bordering on nonsense. So I'm glad to sort of be out of there. Ryan does most of that. But the legal challenges, which the Springs Council is really on the forefront of, I've been deeply involved in those. I found those really interesting. I've played I guess, a significant role in a number of those, and we can talk about any of those that you like to talk about. That's a very long answer. I apologize.
No, it was a great answer. Yeah, so let's begin to talk about some of those initiatives. I mean, you know, pick whatever one you want to begin.
Well, there's a couple. The legal initiative. Yeah. There's a couple active cases now that are both in front of the First District Court of Appeals. One involves Nestle, which is now Blue Triton or whatever. I don't know if Nestle owns Blue Triton. I've heard comments on both sides of that question. I don't really care. It's you know, it's an unnecessary 1 million gallons a day going into plastic bottles. The legal meanderings on this case are too complicated to go into for your purposes, but people can go to the First District Court of Appeals website, pull up the case, and it shows all the paperwork there. But where it stands now is, and to backtrack a second, it's so complicated that the Water Management District, the Suwannee District, which approved the permit, at other times have actually sued to void the permit. And their initial recommendation was not to grant it. They were sort of forced to grant it against their better judgment. They sued to reverse their own decision. That didn't work out so well. So anyway, now the litigant now against the permittee, and the permittee is Seven Springs Water Company. The litigant is the Florida Springs Council. And it's the first time we've actually been the litigant. We've, in the past, been the spokesman, the organizer for local groups that have been suing on something. So this is very interesting. There's a couple issues here. I won't get into legal, complicated legal issues because they're not really substantive, they're procedural. One of the issues is the company that has the permit doesn't actually control the facility, and that's what the district had a problem with in the first place. So that'll be an ongoing issue to be resolved at the District Court of Appeals. The more interesting issue to me, which hasn't really come up yet in a substantive way, is the public interest. If you look at Florida law, to get a water permit, you got to satisfy 3 conditions. And the third one is it has to be consistent with the public interest. This was written into law in 1972. Public interest has never been adequately defined. It's never been adequately litigated. But we would like a chance to get this case thrown back to the Department of Administrative Hearings, DOA, and ultimately back to the district itself to argue the public interest case, which has never really been argued in any of these permits. And it goes back to the original water law in 1972. It was very consciously put in there. The districts would just prefer not to deal with the public interest. It's too squishy. I think the board members, it's there so members of the board of these water management districts can make these judgment calls. What's in the public interest, what isn't? Is 1 million gallons a day out of an iconic spring just to put water in a bottle that you can get out of a tap, is that really in the public interest? The board should be considering those questions. They dodge them. They don't. They haven't, they won't.
Let's discuss why that's an issue. So if you look at the St. John's Water Management District's numbers, in terms of water quantity, bottling accounts for roughly 2% of the total, right? Agriculture, 25%, consumptive use, 55% roughly. Why is the focus on things like Nestle, which accounts for 2%, and not consumptive use or agriculture?
And a lot of the people that are passionate about stopping Nestle don't understand that basic fact. And you're right. Of all the water that's consumed in the Suwannee district, this is the Suwannee district that's in charge of the Nestle permit. It's a relatively small proportion. The impact on that spring, however, is disproportionate to the size of the permit.
Okay.
And Ryan Smart has quantified that. The drawdown at that spring itself, where they're sucking the water, is not 1 or 2%. It's considerably more than that. So there's that. There's the plastics issue. There's the issue that most of the water in the Suwannee district goes to farms. Probably, if you mentioned St. John's, if you're in the St. John's, there's a lot more people in the St. John's district. So probably the number one consumption of water in St. John's is public supply, which means houses. Yeah. And there's agriculture and there's other uses there. But in the Suwannee district, where the Nestle permit, agriculture is by far number one. You can make a public interest argument that agriculture is at least producing food, and we have to eat. And this is what the farmers say when they get questioned about the size of their permits. And it's kind of hard to argue with that. You can argue around the edges. I would argue that area of Florida is not a very good place to conduct agriculture. It's karst, it's sandy. You got to put all kinds of water and all kinds of fertilizer in it because it's really crappy soil. You probably shouldn't be farming there intensively. There's certain crops that are okay, but to grow corn is insane in those conditions. But they can do it because the water's free, and the fertilizer, despite what farmers claim, is relatively cheap. So they can make a profit growing things that probably shouldn't be growing. But anyway, yeah, you're right. The vast majority of the water there goes to farms, but they have a better public interest argument for their need for the water than a bottling plant does.
And I think you made an interesting, argument where you discussed the effect on that specific spring and how, it is disproportionate at that kind of hyperlocal level. I mean, that's not something I've heard before, and I think that it does kind of provide a little bit more nuance and substance to that argument, right? Because it's like, by protecting one spring, you're protecting essentially the entire watershed, right? So, it kind of has that butterfly effect that kind of occurs, right? Right.
And of course, the Santa Fe and the Santa Fe Springs are currently in a state of recovery, which means there isn't enough water there for people and the environment. The district has proposed a new rule, the two districts actually, St. John's and Suwannee, which would convert the status of the springs in the Santa Fe from in recovery, which means they're in terrible shape, to in prevention, which means within the next 20 years, they'll be in recovery, there won't be enough water. So that's sort of convenient, but yeah, we're talking about a drawdown in a spring and in a river system that currently doesn't have enough water. And the state has recognized it doesn't have enough water. So would it help to restore 1 million gallons a day? Yeah, it would help some. It would certainly help that local spring, the nearby springs. But it's not like we have plenty of water there. We don't have enough. So that's relevant. The other, if I can jump shift a little, the other legal case that's in front of the District Court of Appeals is the BMAP case. And BMAPs are Basin Management Action Plans. So with Nestle, we're talking about water quantity, and we can talk about more cases involving water quantity. There's past cases, and there's potentially future cases in water quantity. And we can go into any of those you want, involving the Rainbow River, and the Silver River, and the Santa Fe River. But in terms of water quality, these BMAPs, Basin Management Action Plans, have been around a long time in Florida. They're used in all kinds of water systems, lakes, rivers, streams, and springs. And they were beefed up in the 2016 water law, made more stringent for springs. The Springs Council, and I was lobbying on that bill at the time, actually opposed the 2016 law. I think the Springs Council was probably the only major environmental group that opposed that law.
And why?
And our position was, okay, it speeds up determination of MFLs, minimum flows and levels. It speeds up production of BMAPs, the Basin Management Action Plans, but those tools aren't effective anyway. So what we need to do is make them more effective, not just speed them up. So they set deadlines. You've got to do BMAPs on all the springs by 2018. Okay, we've speeded them up, that's great, but they're still ineffective. I think subsequent events have proven us right. The department, as required by law, issued these springs BMAPs in 2018. They were hopelessly ineffective, these plans, so we sued. A bunch of, I say we, it was a bunch of the local groups. I think there were 10 or 11 litigants, including about 3 individuals and 6 or 8 groups sued on them. We had a 7-day hearing in Tallahassee in front of a judge, hearing judge, administrative hearing judge. She ruled 100% in favor of the state, DEP. We were suing Department of Environmental Protection. I think her reasoning was flawed. If you were at the summit, one of the state's arguments was that these plans are supposed to show how the springs will come into compliance with state law within 20 years. Compliance means 0.35 milligrams per liter of nitrate. You interviewed, what's his name, Matt Cohen, who thinks nitrate is irrelevant. Nat's not alone, but he's certainly a minority view there. The state doesn't agree with him. Bob Knight doesn't agree with him. But anyway, it is complicated. The water quality problems are not just nitrates. I mean, Matt's right, oxygen's involved. I think rates are incredibly important. So, you know, if you've got a water body that's in recovery, there's not enough water, that's going to make the water quality problem worse. So all these things interact, but nitrate is significant. And the BMAP said the plans had to get to 0.35 nitrate in 20 years. They didn't do that. DEP said, we don't have to do that. We just have to have a target. Our target is 0.35, but if our plans don't get there in 20 years, that doesn't matter because we've written down a target. Well, you were at the Spring Summit. I was sitting next to former Senator David Simmons, who is the primary author of that bill. And I mentioned this in the panel, and I said, you know, DEP's taken this position that they don't have to meet the target in 20 years, they just have to establish a target. And I don't recall Simmons' exact words, the guy who wrote the law, but he said that's preposterous. It is preposterous, it's ridiculous. The judge agreed, the fact the judge agreed with it is ridiculous. So we're taking this case to the District Court of Appeals. That's one of our 3 major complaints. The other 2 is the law says you've got to allocate the reductions in nitrogen to different groups. Farmers have to reduce this much, lawn fertilizer has to be reduced this much, stormwater has to be, so forth and so on, septics have to be, and BMAPs across the state have done this. I mean, there's counties all over the state that today are grappling with how are we going to reduce our nitrate because we've been assigned this reduction. We have to meet this legal reduction. In this case, the BMAPs for the springs didn't do any of these allocations, so nobody's responsible for doing anything. And the judge agreed with that, which is silly.
To just clarify,
Yeah.
People in the springs, the BMAPs that people had to deal with in the springs didn't set a goal that was binding. People in other parts of the state, though, did have to comply with the legally binding goal.
Right.
Okay, just wanted to clarify
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And the third issue we had a gripe with was future growth, which is in the law. We know 20 years from, and these things have to be compliant in 20 years, not compliant with the situation today, the situation that we can project in 20 years. It isn't that hard to project. We have very reputable state agencies that look at population growth. We know what population roughly is going to, approximately is going to be in 20 years. It's not going to be less than it is now. It's going to be more. Everybody knows that. We have good projections from the Department of Agriculture on agricultural growth. In that Swanee region, agriculture is growing. It's growing because land's cheap, water's free, and even though the soil isn't very good, there's a lot of agricultural entities moving up here from South Florida and from California, where they have real problems with water and land prices. And they're moving down from Georgia. Florida's cheap. Agriculture's cheap here. So the projections, there was a projection, the last estimate from the Agriculture Department said that ag could grow by 40% in the Swanee District in the next 20 years.
Wow.
But they looked at irrigation growth, and that was, well, if irrigation is going to grow 40%, fertilizer is going to grow by 40%. It's pretty much 1-to-1 ratio. So I think since then they've dropped that projected growth somewhat, but they're still projecting growth. So you do these BMAPs, you've got to account for 20 years from now, we're going to have more people and probably more agriculture. So we've got to meet that target. DEP in their BMAP said, well, that's too hard. We can't, we don't really know. We said, well, you've got sister state agencies telling you what those numbers are. You can look them up. Well, we don't, we never talked to them. We don't really know. So they refused to deal with future growth. So those are our 3 issues in the BMAP. I really think we've got a winning case. I think DEP's posture on this is shameful. You can argue about how important nitrogen is or whether it should be 0.35 or it's 0.28 in some springs or 0.5 or some other. You can argue the science, but you can't argue the law. The law is pretty clear on what they should be doing, and they're clearly avoiding it. And they're avoiding it because the politics is hard. They would actually have to offend some people. They'd have to bite into some growth. They'd have to bite into some agriculture. They'd have to find a lot of money for converting septic tanks. It's a big problem. But I think the legislature has, nobody that's elected up there would ever admit this, but I think de facto they've agreed to sacrifice the springs. They know what it would take to fix it. They're not doing it. I mean, they're not all smart up there. All our elected officials aren't all smart. But there's plenty of smart people up there that know what's going on. And what's going on is the springs are not being fixed. And they're not being fixed because to do so would take a lot of money and would offend a lot of people. And so I think de facto, maybe in their subconscious, maybe in their frontal lobes, they're real conscious. They've sort of made a pact with the devil. They're going to sacrifice the springs.
From my understanding, another issue with, with these basic management plans is that you essentially have the agricultural industry almost regulating itself in a lot of different ways, right? It's like, even things like the thresholds for nitrogen or phosphorus use, established by University of Florida, aren't necessarily the correct numbers when it seems like, if they were, things wouldn't be getting worse, things would be getting better, logically. So kind of discuss why these best management plans are almost set up to fail on purpose.
The best management practices on farms or the BMAPs?
The BMAPs, I'm sorry.
Well, I think I touched on it.
Yeah.
We've had a very politicized Department of Environmental Protection. Everyone, you heard it at the summit, everyone feels they have to say this, and I think they're right. There's a lot of really good people that work at DEP and that work in the water management districts. There's a lot of really good scientists. There's a lot of people with their hearts in the right place. But let's face it, they're subject to the political direction from Tallahassee. We could talk about the people that worked at the St. John's district, for instance, who were fired for absolutely no reason, except they told the truth about various issues. Very, reputable, good scientists who were fired. They came in Monday morning and they didn't have a job anymore. No recourse, zero. Because what they were saying was not consistent with the political message. And that happened across the board at St. John's. And it's happened at other water management districts as well. So the message gets conveyed pretty clearly. If you're out there, you're going to get your head chopped off. And we've had, I think under the Scott and DeSantis administrations, we've had a very politicized DEP. And they know who their masters are. They know, where the financial interests are, and they pretty much respect them. So they nibble around the edges with cost share programs, best management practices, various projects. They put in sewer lines where there were septic tanks. All these things are helpful, but if you add them all up, all the things they're doing to fix the problems, I don't think are making up for what future growth's going to do. I think they're actually benefiting less than the additional problems that are going to be heaped on us with future growth. So they're mediating future growth to a certain degree. They're not fixing the basic problem. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
It definitely does. And I guess an additional one would be, as someone that kind of has had one foot in academia as a scientist, another foot in policy, working in DC, kind of describe describe that system a little bit more, right? So I think for someone like me, right, when I kind of hear, a testimony like yours, and I'm kind of hearing that these scientists are getting fired for essentially saying the truth by providing objective numbers, but then at the same time, you hear people say believe in science. It's kind of hard to, understand. It's kind of hard to know what to believe, right? So what numbers to believe, especially when you realize that some of these numbers are, let's be honest, directly manipulated to fit a certain agenda. For someone like me or for the audience that's kind of listening, how do you go about navigating, trying to understand the objective numbers?
Yeah, you're right. It's hard. I have a PhD, but it's in a narrow field. I had the benefit working in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee for all those years of interacting with every branch of science. Nobel laureates on down, energy, environment, space, material science. I had almost 30 years of really good experience. And this is maybe bragging, and I don't like to brag, but I think I developed a good bullshit detector. You really need a good bullshit detector, because in the political environment, people are coming with an agenda. They're also coming with their data. And, some people are very rigorous and scientific with their data, others are not. This is a problem you raised. And there's no simple answer to that question. I think some of these legal challenges revolve more around legal questions than scientific questions. We've been very frustrated in our legal challenges, and I'll go back to some of the water quantity challenges. we challenged the MFL. I haven't mentioned MFLs, minimum flows and levels. So all the springs and rivers and so forth in Florida have an MFL, which is supposed to determine the minimum flow on the minimum level you need to have a healthy river or spring. You can't fall below that level. So it's science, right? I mean, there's a lot of debate about what that number should be. So there was a Rainbow River MFL. Rainbow is one of our iconic rivers and springs. Came out in, 2017, 2018. We challenged it. The Rainbow River Conservation, Inc. challenged it. Springs Council supplied a lot of the help on that. And we went in front of an administrative law judge, and it was really a science argument, unfortunately. And you get in front of these judges, and you may be having problem with distinguishing the data. I have problems distinguishing different purveyors of the data. Imagine an administrative law judge who has no scientific background whatsoever. This guy who presided over the Rainbow case for 3 or 4 days never asked a single question, not one. He had no scientific background, really no environmental background. He had a legal background. I don't know that he understood the arguments. I thought we wrote a very good brief, but it came, and Bob Knight, we referred to Bob earlier. Bob produced his own water model for that challenge to go up against the district's model. It was interesting in that case. The district admitted that flows in the Rainbow River were 20% below historic levels. They conceded that point. And the flows are very low. They're not healthy at healthy levels. Bob said it's at least 12, 14% of that is due to groundwater pumping. The district essentially said groundwater pumping had a negligible effect on the fact that this river is down. Well, what was the cause? Well, rainfall, they said, rainfall patterns. Well, we analyzed the rainfall data. They had no credible case, I did not think, based on rainfall data, that there's been a long trend of 20% less water. In the Santa Fe, by the way, we were talking about the bottling permit earlier on the Santa Fe River. Santa Fe flows are down 25 to 30%.
Wow.
There's a new MFL right now that's working its way through the system. They say the rivers, we can upgrade the river from in recovery to in prevention because there's enough water there right now. There won't be in 20 years. Well, that's nonsense. There's not enough water there right now. I want to hear the district's explanation as to why the flows are so far down. I did a graph, I should have brought it out here, I could show the camera, but I did a graph of decade by decade, what's the flow in the Santa Fe River, based on their own data, by the way. I had the Suwannee District send me their data, year by year data, at one of the gauges that they use for the MFL. If you plot it just decade by decade by decade, starting in the 1920s, it kind of goes boom, 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 and the bottom falls out the last 3 decades. We've really had no rain for 30 years. Is that what they're saying? That's not true. The Southwest District in the Rainbow case invoked AMO, Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. It's a fancy concept to impress a judge. It was completely meaningless in the case of the Rainbow River. It's the notion that because of water, almost like El Nino, water temperatures and trends in the Atlantic drive these decadal or multi-decadal weather patterns, and somehow the Rainbow River was in this bad pattern. Well, the Rainbow River was actually, if you look at the people that actually study the AMO, was actually in a good period for rainfall. So that was nonsense. The northern part of Florida is supposed to be different from the southern part in terms of the phases of the AMO. Well, where's the rainbow? It's sort of right in the middle. What's that? They wave this concept out. It's complete BS. They put it in front of the judge. The judge bought it. I mean, that's where bad science comes in. I think I was smart and recognized that that was BS. The judge wasn't. So we have a challenge with making sure the right science is heard by the right people in positions of power. But if they're predisposed not to listen, they're predisposed to listen to their political contributors or their political desires, it makes it pretty tough for them to hear the real science. It's a tough problem.
Yeah, and that's another issue I've kind of been understanding that's kind of occurred is that, as time has gone by, powers become more centralized, in places like the DEP. Cities, counties have less and less power to do what they want at a local basis, and everything's kind of going into these boards that are essentially appointed by the governor. So it's like you have all the science, all these kind of major decisions are supposed to take 20 or 30 years being made at the political ones that are happening today. I mean, how do you go about,
well, you just have to keep plugging away,
I guess, right?
My wife asks me all the time, why are you still volunteering to do all this stuff? And why does Bob Knight spend 50 hours a week doing it? It's a good question. You just have to keep plugging away. I remember in Washington, I watched for 20 years while the amendments to the Clean Air Act were debated. 20 years. And they finally, I didn't watch all 20 years, but I watched the last 15 roughly. Clean Air Act amendments finally got adopted in 1990. It took 20 years. And it kind of fixed the acid rain problem, but it took 20 years. These things take forever. You mentioned the boards, the Water Management District boards. Dr. Knight and I both applied to serve on the St. John's Water Management District Board. And Ryan Smart, who was a fairly new director of FSC at that point, turned this into a campaign. He recruited 10 or 12 people who were either environmentalists or scientists or both to put their name in to serve on the Water Management District boards because there were no environmentalists and no scientists on any of the boards, zero. And that's outrageous. So we dutifully filled out the form, sent them up to Tallahassee. Needless to say, none of us were selected. Those boards are disproportionately represented by developers and agriculture. There's a few good board members that stand up and do some good things, but very, very few. So, it does come down to elections ultimately, doesn't it? And, we heard the talks from Representative Escamani at the recent summit. And she's a Democrat, but she kind of has equal scorn for members of both parties because the Democrats don't fight anything. They fight some issues. They don't fight any environmental issues in Tallahassee. I'll go back to the 2016 law, which the Springs Council opposed, the water law, which included the Florida Aquifer and Springs Protection Act. That was one portion of that law, which sounds great, right? But didn't really do anything for Springs. But that was when I was more active lobbying in Tallahassee, and I had written a bunch of amendments to this law to try to improve it. And I went up there to try to sell these amendments, and I found a member of the House and a member of the Senate who were interested in helping. And it was the Democratic leader in the House, and it was Senator Darren Soto in the Senate. Senator Soto is now a member of U.S. Congress from Orlando. Very smart young member. But he was a Florida state senator at the time. He said, give me your best 4 amendments. And Senator Soto offered them in committee. He offered them on the Senate floor. Same thing in the House, offered them. But there were no votes taken on any of these amendments. And I went to the gentleman I was working with later in the House and Senate and said, why didn't you get votes on these amendments? They're good amendments. They said, because we couldn't keep the Democratic caucus voting the right way on those amendments. All the Republicans were going to vote against them because they went with their chairman's bill. They weren't going to amend their chair, or they went with the leadership bill. They made it clear they weren't going to change a word in the bill. But the Democrats, when I was in D.C., I learned this I was a Democratic staff director. I learned it from the Republicans. They offered 1 million amendments. They got our members on the record voting on amendments, and those became election issues, and rightfully so. Members have to stand for what they stand for. So if the minority party is going to offer amendments and put people on the record, God bless them. That's their role. They're the minority. They don't have a lot of power. That's one of the powers they have. Tallahassee, nobody uses that power, at least in the environment. They use it in some other issues. You see party line votes on Medicare and some other issues, but you never see it in the environment. And the reason is the Democratic senators and representatives are too fearful to actually vote in favor of good amendments. They won't do it. They don't care enough about the environment to do it. That's why Eskamani's dinner speech and her speech at that panel was kind of, a pox on both houses. And she's right. If they had any brains, these Democratic representatives, they would demand votes on key environmental issues, force people on the record. Yeah, they might lose they had a project in the district to pave a parking lot in a school somewhere. They might not get that $200,000 to pave that parking lot because they forced a vote. But damn it, they'd get people on the record. And the next election, somebody running could say, your representative voted no on these good amendments. He or she doesn't care about the environment. That's how you get leaders that are better. That's the only way you get leaders that are better. You got to hold them accountable for their voting record. And we don't have a system here. I'm so frustrated. I mean, like I said, I learned this from the Republicans. And then when Newt Gingrich took over the House in 1995, we did the same thing to them, and successfully.
So you've kind of mentioned quite a bit about this difference between the way the Congress in D.C. operates versus the Congress, in the state, the state operates. I mean, kind of elaborate on that more. Why is there such a big difference? I mean, because if you look at environmental issues, you get 80, 70, 90%, right, of that people agree with, but we're not seeing this environmental legislation kind of enacted.
Nobody calls them to account.
Yeah.
Nobody calls them to account. So when people are running, what the press should do, what the opponent, what editorial boards should do, anybody that can get a hearing with the people running, ought to ask them direct, pointed questions that require a yes or no answer. Not vague stuff about, do you support the environment? Do you like clean water? Do you want to clean up the springs? Do you think we should convert septic? Really tough questions. Should Nestle get a permit? Yes or no? Is it in the public interest for them to get a permit? Yes or no? Do we need to change agricultural practices somewhat? Yes or no? Do you think the current regulatory system is working? Do you think the BMAFs and the MFLs are working? If not, what would you change? I can think of a bunch of very pointed questions that put people on the record, and serious questions. In the Congress, I mean, I'm going back 45 years when I got there, and it changed when I was there. But it was a far more serious body than Tallahassee, and hopefully it still is. I don't know that it is. But for one, the members aren't term limited. I understand there's arguments on both sides of term limits. There's some appeal to term limits. But in Tallahassee, it's a disaster. Because you have people that cycle through there, they don't know what they're doing. The leadership runs everything. People pretty much vote as they're told to. You have one or two people on each side, House and Senate, that determine everything. And they're probably listening to 5 or 6 key lobbyists. And that's who runs everything. When I got to the Congress, it was a much more, first of all, there's no term limits. So you had members there. I worked for some members who I think were national experts on issues. They were national experts on health.
In D.C.
In D.C. Yeah. They were national experts on science issues. Because they'd been there, they'd heard everything, they'd seen everything, they were smart. Some of them were there too long, right. That's the downside of no term limits. But there were some really, capable senior members, and seniority was respected there very much. You didn't get to chair a committee because you raised the most money, by and large. They respected seniority. Interestingly, seniority was very important in the Democratic caucus because the Black and Hispanic and women members really wanted seniority because they were concerned that if their seniority wasn't respected, they'd get voted, they wouldn't get a chairmanship. The minority people and the women would be excluded from positions of power. With seniority, they were protected. So that was an interesting situation. But anyway, we put people in jail. up there. You know, we did investigations. We got people convicted of felonies. We got people convicted of lying to Congress that served jail terms. I mean, it was a serious body. We had subpoena power. We had very strong investigative power. My greatest frustration with Tallahassee, and I have many, is they pass laws, they often sound good, they often don't, but then they just forget about them.
They don't force
They
them.
do no oversight whatsoever. And I was frustrated at the summit, and we heard 2 or 3 questions along the same line of, you know, how do we get these laws enforced? You know, we know what the law says, but somehow they're not being implemented. And former Senator Simmons, I think, gave the wrong answer, which is, well, you guys need to do it. You need to sue. That's part of the answer, and we're not afraid to sue, and we're suing. The other part of the answer is the damn legislature needs to do their job. And when I was working in the Congress, I was regarded, you know, we had budgetary responsibilities. That was part of the job, determining agency budgets. We wrote the laws. That was part of the job. I regarded probably the most important part of the job is overseeing the laws and seeing that they're actually carried out. And, you know, because you learn maybe they're not such great laws. Maybe they need to, that's a path to learn how to amend the laws and improve the laws. But you got to figure out what's going on. Are they being implemented? Are they not? If they're not, is there a bad reason they're not? A good reason they're not? Why aren't they? Tallahassee does zero, at least in the environmental area, zero.
And that appears to be the issue with some of the best management plans that are kind of enacted. This idea that, you know, these exist, right, but someone has 2,000 acres of field, right, and you don't know whether they're acting the same way across the entire property, right? So it's like, if there's no enforcement, you know, what are you going to do about that? You know, it essentially doesn't exist, right?
And the legislature, I'm sure the staff is probably aware of those issues, but it never comes out in public. You know, if you go to the hearings in Tallahassee, and I've pretty much lost patience with them, they'll call up the agency reps, and the agency reps, the DEP, or in the case of environmental issues, DEP, or the Water Management District, will come up and say, you know, everything's fine. You know, we thank you for this law. We're implementing it faithfully. We have all these programs. Everything's great. Ryan and I have written questions I did a lot of that when I was in Washington, wrote questions for the members. Sometimes the members would let me ask the questions. We're pretty good at writing questions to get to the heart of the matter. We've written questions for the members of the committees in Tallahassee, pointed questions designed to get reality on the record. The members are afraid to ask them, or they don't understand them well enough to ask them because they never do any oversight, and the staff doesn't tell them what's going on. You know, the other difference is the staff in DC, the committee, particularly the committee staffs, are pretty damn good. And there's certainly some good staff people in Tallahassee, but the majority of them are poorly paid, young, inexperienced, you know, making their way up the ladder, filling out their resume with something that looks good. They're not deep policy or legal thinkers by and large. I have met with some senior people up there that are really sharp, and they're by and large working for leadership. But yeah, the members don't get the full story, and if they do, they're afraid to pursue it. It's very frustrating. And I think the only way to fix it is what I said earlier. You've got to get these people on the record and figure out a way to unelect them.
Absolutely. Unelect
them. And you know, we hear these vague terms all the time about, you know, elect people that are friendly to the environment. Well, that's meaningless blather. That doesn't mean anything. You have to get them on their record.
So let's go back to some of those case studies you mentioned about water quantity. So you mentioned one, give me some others that you think are notable.
Yeah, I mentioned the rainbow, which we failed on, and we decided not to pursue that to the Court of Appeals because it was mostly a science argument. And how are you going to win a science argument? It was interesting when we wrote, this is what I've really enjoyed, one of the things I've really enjoyed doing, being retired and volunteering, is when you come to the end of the case, you write a proposed order for the judge. So both sides write a proposed order, and then the judge writes the judge's final order. And the judge can select portions of either one or neither, or whatever. In the case of the Rainbow, the judge pretty much backed up everything that was in Swift-Mudd's order. But we wrote a 70 or 80 page order, and it was done with Doug McLaughlin, who was on the panel at the summit. And Doug's a retired water management district attorney. Doug wrote the legal portion of that brief, and I wrote the science portion. It was sort of 40 pages each, which was really fun. And I did the same thing in the BMAP, brief, where John Thomas wrote the legal portion, I wrote the science portion. The BMAP challenge is much more of a legal challenge, so I feel better about that one. But yeah, the silver, in terms of water quantity, there was the Rainbow Challenge. There was earlier, and I wasn't involved in it, a challenge to the earlier Santa Fe Ichtuckney MFL that was brought, I think, around 2012, unsuccessfully. I don't think they brought a really very good case. I mentioned that MFL is in draft right now, and there'll have to be a decision made as to whether to challenge that. There are people eager to challenge that, but again, if it comes down to a science argument, are we going to be able to persuade a judge with a science argument? It's going to be hard.
And why do you say that? Why is science argument so hard?
Persuading a judge about a science argument, because they don't understand the science. Okay. And they defer to the agency by and large. I mean, there was a constitutional amendment 3 or 4 years ago that's in the Florida Constitution now that says agencies get no deference in a challenge on legal matters. So if it's a question of interpreting the law, the agencies get no deference at all. However, it doesn't say anything about science questions. And judges tend to default to the agency scientists. It's just their history. Most of them are not scientists. None of them are scientists that I'm aware of. So anyway, I mentioned the Rainbow, I mentioned the Santa Fe. The other one that was a problem was the Silver River MFL, which was about 5 years ago. The Rainbow was in Swift-Mudd. The Santa Fe Ichtuckney is Suwannee and St. John's. The Silver River MFL is strictly in St. John's. And that was kind of a horror show. I wasn't really involved in the first round of that either, but there was a second round. There was a challenge to the emergency MFL and then the challenge to the final MFL. And I was involved in the final MFL, and there was, unfortunately, only one petitioner who was a businesswoman who worked on the river, cared deeply about the river, and we should have had additional petitioners. But the St. John's District, in their wisdom, decided to accuse her of perjury and threaten her with all kinds of legal recourse, and it was complete nonsense. They were claiming that her deposition and Dr. Knight's deposition had some points in conflict about when she decided to challenge the MFL. It was splitting hairs, it was nonsense, but they basically scared her and intimidated her because she was facing huge fines, legal action. She couldn't afford any of this. That's our water management district. They're supposed to be there protecting our resources, and they're threatening not wealthy, independent businesswomen with perjury and huge fines. They're supposed to represent our environment. I was appalled at that behavior. So that, what's also appalling was, that was the district that fired all those people over their conclusions about whether there's enough water. There's a gentleman here, I don't think he'd mind his name being used, Jim Gross, crack geologist.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Been certified by everyone as a great geologist for 40 years, worked all over the country. He was fired summarily because he dared to question whether there was enough water there for this MFL and other activities in the district. They fired him. They fired several other people. So what happened was when that MFL went before the staff, the original staff's recommendation was, I can't remember if it was the MFL or the Stronach permit. I think it was the Stronach permit, which is a huge water pumping for a cattle operation. The staff recommended denial. And then lo and behold, the staff came back like 2 months later and reran the model. And they found new science. And lo and behold, they found there was suddenly enough water. And in the meantime, all these people got fired. So the staff itself got told by somebody to find the water. And I don't think that was their scientist. I think that was Tallahassee telling them to go find their water. We know from many sources that Tallahassee has told these districts, issue these permits and issue them more quickly. That's your job. And I think everybody got the message. So when you see people getting fired, innocent people threatened with perjury, and staff recommendations being overridden because we found new science, how much faith do you have in that process? Not very much. And where do you go to get justice? Well, you go to a Department of Administrative Hearings hearing. And you're in front of a judge who doesn't understand the science. So this is pretty dark talk, sorry.
No,
not very, but I try to deal with reality, and that's the reality.
That's exactly what, the type of stuff I want to put on record. And I think it kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier about not knowing what to believe, right? Based upon this, it's like they said, believe science, right? Well, you have to believe the scientist to believe the science first, right?
Well, some of it, like Matt Cohen and Bob Knight have different views of nitrate. I respect them both. I think they're both really smart guys. I don't think any of them have either one of them have a nefarious agenda. It's scientific disagreement.
Which exists, right?
Which is good, and hopefully they talk. I think they do. I know Bob respects Matt. I was at an FSI board meeting last week, and Matt's name came up. Bob has high regard for him. So I think they respect each other as scientists. And these issues about, in this case, nitrate, how much of the degradation is due to nitrate, how much is oxygen, how much is snails, how much is flow levels, because we know that the more the flow, the faster the flow is in the springs, the more it's going to wash algae out of the system and make the system a lot healthier. And, Matt was part of this CRISP study, which maybe has come up in your interviews, funded by St. John's and conducted mostly by the University of Florida and St. John's scientists, overseen by Casey Fitzgerald, who's now president of the Florida Springs Council. Casey retired from St. John's, was never fired by St. John's. Probably a good guy to talk to. He lives about a mile and a half that way. Casey Fitzgerald, longtime senior staffer at St. John's. But he was in charge of that CRISP study for St. John's. And as I said, now president of the Springs Council, so he's retired. But part of that study was looking at flow and what happens with higher flow and algae. And this is not news, this has been demonstrated in other studies, but it showed conclusively that you get above a certain threshold of flow and you pretty much get rid of the algae. So, is it nitrogen, is it oxygen, snails, is it flow? It's probably all of them. Nitrogen, the CRISP study not only demonstrated the impact of flow, conclusively demonstrated the impact of nitrate. And Matt was part of the CRISP study, and his presentation seems to ignore that part of the CRISP study that actually documented that nitrate does matter. Matt doesn't talk about that, he should, but it's there in black and white. You can talk to Casey about it. Casey funded it all. So yeah, it's complicated. The science, and every spring is different. And the science is different. In some springs, if you bubble oxygen in like they're doing in Hornsby, it's probably going to help. Other systems that may not do a damn thing. Knight seems to think, in listening to some of Matt's stuff, I always wonder, well, why is the oxygen low? And Knight says it's probably because of the nitrate levels that it's low. So, the water coming to the aquifer, I don't know enough about this to talk intelligently, but I'm assuming the water in the aquifer is reasonable. It's constant temperature. Is the oxygen level fairly similar throughout the aquifer? I don't know. I guess if I had to guess, I'd guess it's fairly similar what's coming out.
From my understanding that, and I might be wrong about this, but oxygen levels in the aquifer tend to be lower because it's underground and doesn't have as much movement, right? So, maybe that's a factor.
Maybe the newer water is higher in oxygen, and the water coming out of, and the age of the water coming out of the springs, I think, is highly different. I mean, they've done nitrate studies showing water can move, a mile in a week, or really fast. And this old notion that it takes 20 or 100 years to, in some springs, in some channels to certain springs, that is total nonsense. It gets there really fast.
Also, it appears that Dr. Cohen also mentioned this idea that, depending on how the water bodies are connected, right, it's like, maybe more tannic, maybe more tannic water kind of gets pushed back. It kind of creates this murky, water for a couple of weeks that causes oxygen levels to go down, etc. So, I mean, the way I understand it from kind of just talking to everybody, it appears that it's a death by 1,000 cuts. I think, like you said, I think maybe some cases it might be one thing, and other cases it might be the other. But I'm not a PhD, so. And
the state has chosen to keep the story simple, which is it's nitrate. We got to clean up the nitrate.
Yeah.
I personally think this flow issue, scouring out the algae, is incredibly important. And we actually argued in the Rainbow case, and this is a link between water quantity and water quality. We argued in the Rainbow MFL case that they should be using flow levels in the Rainbow to look at the impact of those flow levels on algae. Because if you look at MFL looks at these biological indicators, and if some of these indicators get compromised, then it triggers the MFL. Our argument was the flow is low enough to trigger a number of these indicators, like algal growth, recreation. You can't recreate go to Post Springs and try to recreate while you're fighting your way through the algae. So I think that the flow rate should be part of the MFLs, and we argued that at the Rainbow case. I wondered, as they were developing this Santa Fe Itchtuckney MFL, were they going to look at flow levels as part of the MFL? And they didn't. And I actually talked to the staff up there like 2 years ago and said, are you going to look at the flow levels as a critical variable in determining where to set this MFL? Well, we're looking at it, we're doing research. So they started a research program. So if we sue them, they're going to go to the judge, they're going to argue in front of the judge, yeah, that's probably really important, but we have this great research program that we're looking at that. And I think the reason they started the research program was to fight off the legal challenge. Because SwiftMud did the same thing at Rainbow. They said, well, we have a little bit of data, but we're starting this research program. And the judge bought it. The judge said, well, they're going to do a research program, so we don't have to look at flow. Flow is incredibly important. I mean, the guy, Nathan Reaver, I think is his name, got his PhD doing work as part of that CRISP program. I don't know who his advisor was. I don't think it was Dr. Cohen. Cohen's certainly aware of it, as is everybody at this point, because it was great work. But Reaver did the work showing that at a certain level, the algae get washed out. And he has some video that's just wildly dramatic about the impact of flow, because he not only looked at the natural situation, he set up barriers and barricades, and things that directed the flow a certain way, just to show at different velocities what actually happens to the algae. And they not only can't settle on the eelgrass, they can't stay there. They get blown away. So that's a pretty big deal, and it really should be part of the water quantity discussion. Flow rates and velocity should be part of that. Maybe in 20 years it will be. Can I put in a pitch for something else?
Of course.
Or do you have a burning question?
By all means.
So I wanted to put in a pitch for this because, as I mentioned, I got on the board of the Springs Institute early on, and we had quarterly board meetings. We talked about science. Back in those days, we talked more about advocacy because Bob and I were going to Tallahassee occasionally, and we were under the limit of how much advocacy you could do, percentage of your time, and all that. So it was all legal. But it occurred to me, looking at the work of the Springs Institute, which was education, science, monitoring, and the little bit of advocacy we were doing, that there was a big hole in the middle there. There was nobody doing policy. And nobody in the state government wanted to look at policy, because if you look at policy, you come up with solutions or suggestions which may not be widely received or happily received. So I said what FSI really ought to do is do some policy. Well, we didn't have any money to hire somebody to do that. So I was talking to somebody along the line. I got hooked up with a guy named Tom Ankerson, who's a law professor at UF, just about to retire.
Yeah.
And Tom's been very active in environmental issues. He ran, for years, he's run what's called the Conservation Clinic at the law school, which is third-year law students take on a project. They work for a city or a county or a nonprofit of some sort, and they delve into a legal and or policy question. So Tom's really good about that. So I approached Tom and said, could we get a program going with FSI as the client and your students as the worker bees, and I'll come up with some policy questions. And he said, great. So we did this for 3 or 4 years. Tom, we're not doing it now because Tom's retiring. But anyway, if you go on the FSI website, and you can find I think there's a link to Learn, and you click on Learn, and there's something that says policy work. And what it's got is these studies that the UF law students have done under the direction of Professor Ankerson and me over the years, and they're pretty interesting. So I'll just read the titles, give you an idea of what the students have delved into. And these are 10 to 25 page papers, legal and policy analyses, some better than others, but some of them are really, I think 3 of them have been published, like in legal journals. So they're pretty good. Florida Water Resources Act, consistent with the public interest. Well, there's that question of the third prong of water permitting, where a permit has to be consistent with the public interest. So this is a deep legal dive into what that consistent with legal interest, public interest means. Look on the bright side. Can solar farms help to reduce nitrate pollution in Florida Springs? This was a concept that Ken Sulak had. If we start putting up solar farms all over North Florida, and they're 600-800 acres, and we put them on some of these karstic areas, maybe where old intensive ag was, could we actually make a dent in the nitrate problem? Interesting question. Defining harm to the water resources in the 2016 legislation. You probably went into this question with Ryan. And we went into it at great depth on that panel with Senator Simmons. The DEP had to essentially define and develop a rule for what harmful to the water resources means for outstanding Florida Springs. That's in the law. They did nothing for 6 years. Ryan finally threatened them and said, we're going to sue you guys. And lo and behold, they last minute, before the end of the legislative session, they came out with this rule, which reiterates everything that's already in law. Senator Simmons was appalled and sent a 10-page letter to the Secretary of DEP. This Senator Simmons is a pretty conservative Republican senator, former senator, and he was appalled by how they implemented the law that he wrote.
Senator Simmons is Republican?
Yes.
And he created the Florida Aquifer?
Yes. Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, he's good environmental guy.
Okay.
Very good credentials, very credible, very knowledgeable. I mean, they're I'm a Democrat, but I've worked with a lot of Republicans. There's a lot of great Republicans on environmental issues. The science committee, when I was there for years, was chaired by a guy named Sherry Bollert, upstate New York, Republican. He was arguably the best environmentalist in the U.S. House. He was fabulous. Republican, there's plenty of them that are great environmentalists. So, and Simmons is one of them. Anyway, I probably don't need to go into harm to the water resources. I expect Ryan did when you interviewed him. Environmental standing in administrative proceedings. We had many questions there, including can Florida Springs Council, which is a consortium of groups, get standing to sue? Interesting question. Using forest thinning to recharge the Floridian aquifer. This is something Cohen talked about, because he got a big grant to do this. But we had a paper from 4 years ago that looked at this concept in some detail.
I also interviewed Dr. Francis Putz. I'm not sure if you know him.
What's his name?
Francis Putz.
Yeah, I know Jack.
Yeah, he was
Yeah,
my professor. I just interviewed him this week too. Yeah.
Yeah, good guy.
Yeah.
Water use fees. We actually have two papers on water use fees, one of which I wrote. Water's free in Florida, even for bottling companies. California and I think several other states, if you want a bottle of water, you got to pay for it. Not in Florida. You pay for the permit, which is $100 or $200 or something. Applying an agricultural privilege tax to reduce Florida Springs nutrient pollution. The Everglades agricultural privilege tax is a tax on farmers for nitrogen. Well, why don't we do that for springs? So this paper looked at the concept of doing something like what they do in the Everglades in the Springs region and actually tax nitrogen use. Springs water velocity, protecting water quality with water quantity regulation. That's the velocity argument. And this was a really smart law student who looked at the feasibility of incorporating velocity into MFLs. Very good paper. So anyway, there's about 10 of them. Their water policy, I don't see anyone else in the state really doing work on these kinds of questions. Florida, the UF has lots of researchers that do research on springs. But correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen UF professors, dying to get work to do policy studies, by and large. I think it's a big hole. We had when I was in DC, we had a lot of help with policy analysis with arms of the Congress, but also outside groups, nonprofits. They're big enough up there to do their policy work. Private companies, they lobby, they put out white papers on issues, and a lot of them are quite good. I mean, lobby to me was never a dirty word. There are good lobbyists and bad lobbyists. And I got a lot of useful information from lobbyists, including industry lobbyists. The good ones are really good. But there's, in DC, you're kind of awash in policy analysis. And you have to do what you're saying about science. You got to differentiate the good from the bad, or the credible from the not credible. Congress had a huge arm called the Congressional Research Service with hundreds of researchers. And, as committee staff, we could bring them in and say, we need an analysis of the following issue. Legal analysis, policy analysis, budgetary, whatever. And it might take a week, it might take 3 years, depending on the scope of the request, but we were awash in policy. I don't see any evidence that Tallahassee is awash in policy analysis on environmental issues.
So I think any good scientist would tell you that good science is replicable, right? So when you have numbers, though, that are given by things like state agencies, it's kind of hard to replicate those numbers, right? Because just the context of those numbers is hard to replicate. How do we replicate that? How do we replicate the good science? How does good science overthrow the bad science in that regard?
Yeah, replicating is not a popular way to get research grants. And you've probably seen the numbers that, X percent of all the biomedical studies, when people try to repeat them, don't work. It's a frighteningly large number, but people aren't paid to replicate existing work. It's often interesting just to get different people to look at the same data. You mentioned earlier, I think, the flow reversals into the springs from the rivers, which have been going on, I think, this winter and last year in the Swanee River, and a lot of the springs because we had such high rainfall. And these reversals go back into the springs, and they turn them brown. Some of the springs are still browned out. And Bob Knight has done a paper on it, which he shared with me, and I thought was really excellent. And I think Dr. Cohen has a substantial grant to look at that question. and they've reached different conclusions. You know, I don't know, I haven't heard Cohen's full argument, but from your interview with him, he was talking about oxygen, and then he mentioned these flow reversals, seemingly implying to me that the flow reversals were responsible for the low oxygen levels. I don't know that that's his position, but just the point in the interview when he said it, it seemed to be the implication. Knight's data, and Bob's gone back many years on flow data in the Swanee, looking at different stations in the Swanee so you can see relative flows. And if you go down streams and there's lesser flow, well, that means that some of it got captured. Probably went back into the ground, into the spring. Surprisingly, and Bob said he didn't expect this, he said there's no evidence that they're more frequent now than they used to be, these flow reversals. So, you know, there's two guys looking at similar data. I would hope somewhere along the line they'd get together and they'd hash it out. They're both good scientists. They ought to be able to come up with hopefully come up with a consistent story that they both agree with. So that's the way to, you know, that's the way to do it. But you got to have two credible people or more to start with, obviously. That seems like a ripe issue for that kind of activity.
Yeah, I just think it's important to kind of clarify and kind of contextualize a lot about, of this kind of, I love this view of starting with science, right? Because as we've discussed throughout this entire interview, it gets complicated, because even among scientists there's not a consensus. But I think the more back and forth that happens, like you just mentioned, the more of a better answer we can come up with. Whether it's perfect or not, it's still consistent, which I think is important. For policy initiatives and everything else.
In the original spring summits, and I think there were, before the one a week or two ago, there were maybe 3 or 4 spring summits, maybe 3. And the Springs Institute had organized them. And so Dr. Knight had a key role in organizing those. And Bob's, fundamentally a scientist. So there were a lot of panels in those initial spring summits with scientists presenting and on the same panel with an opportunity to interact and kick back and issues back and forth in front of the public, which I thought was interesting and useful. This summit that just concluded was obviously not organized that way. I think certainly consciously by Ryan and Brenda, but also we could have had some of that, but we, as was noted at the summit, we invited 6 or 7 representatives of the water management districts and DEP, and every one of them declined. And they all had a great reason, I got family business, whatever. I can't judge whether any of those rationales were legitimate or they were told not to appear. I suspect the latter, but had some of those people come, we could have had some of that back and forth. And we still have some, I can go to the water management districts. Certainly Swanee has a lot of very accessible, friendly, decent scientists that I can call up and get an appointment with and talk and kick things back and forth. I find them a really receptive district. I think Hugh Thomas, who's the director there, really sets the tone. He's a very open, generous guy and a fair guy. So those exchanges do go on, but they're not in front of the public. And I think it's much, this is, when I put together hearings in DC, which I did many of over the years, we always wanted to get conflicting points of view on the panels. And we had members generally who were smart enough to really generate some back and forth, which got heated and sparky at times. I remember, have you ever heard of nuclear winter?
Yeah.
So we had a hearing on nuclear winter one time because it was, I think, during the Reagan administration when they were talking about tactical use of nuclear weapons, right, which we thought was ridiculous. And hopefully it won't happen in Ukraine, right? Yeah. Or Greece, or Serbia.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was crazy. And one of the things the scientists were talking about is you start setting off nuclear weapons, you could generate a nuclear winter where basically agriculture gets shut down. And God knows how long it lasts. So we convened a hearing, and I invited Stephen Jay Gould. You know Stephen Jay Gould? One of the great science communicators, just tremendous paleontologist, died of cancer, unfortunately, about 10 years ago. He was at the MCZ in Harvard, wrote 10 bestsellers, incredible scientist. Carl Sagan, heard of Carl? Carl came.
Yeah, I love it.
And we had a couple of guys from the Defense Department who were defending this policy. Okay, Stephen Jay Gould, Carl Sagan, and a couple guys from the Defense Department. Now that's a hearing. That's a hearing where you're going to get some views expressed back and forth. You know, the defense guys were essentially calling Carl Sagan a blithering fool who didn't know what he was talking about and didn't have the best interests of the country at heart, blah, blah, blah. It was an amazing hearing, you know, but that's the standard. I worked for a guy at one point. We'd put, you know, panels together like this, and we might have an industry guy who was a bad, you know, their company had done something nasty. And I had a guy I worked for who loved doing oversight, loved getting people on the record, loved subpoenaing people. We would sit down at the beginning of the hearing. He'd sit down, and he'd look at the panel, and he'd say, turn to me, and he'd say, which one's the bad guy? And I'd tell him, he'd say, okay, I'll go after him or her. I mean, that's how you run a hearing. You know, you get heads butting. Sometimes you don't. We had a oversight and investigation sub. I go into all this not to relive my past, but to contrast it with Tallahassee. We had an investigations and oversight subcommittee, which was chaired by a guy, you may have heard him, the chairman was a guy named Al Gore.
Yeah.
When Al was in the House, and he chaired this investigations and oversight subcommittee for, I think, 6 years, and then he ran for the Senate and he won the Senate seat in Tennessee. He was a great chairman, but he did oversight and investigations. What does that mean? Half the time he was investigating something, and he would sit in that chair for 8 hours if he had to. He was tireless and really smart and very fair to his Republican colleagues. So he wasn't persecuting someone and not giving the other side a chance. He was very fair, very tough. And the other half was oversight, investigations and oversight, and foresight. So he did a lot of hearings that were just blue sky. Here's some issues that are coming down the pike in the next 10, 20 years, and we really ought to be looking at them. So it was hard ass, put people in jail, or let's blue sky what's coming. And he was great at both of them. Tallahassee doesn't do either.
Good cop, bad cop, right?
Yeah. And, you know, from one day to the next. And he had staff that could go both ways. I put together a hearing in 1980 or 81 on what was called the greenhouse effect. That was the title of the hearing. It wasn't called climate change or global warming. It was called the greenhouse. It was 42 years ago, right? And put together a great panel. There was a pretty good program studying CO2 in the energy department. And the Reagan administration came in and abolished the program. That was the rationale for the hearing, is we wanted to justify the program and start it up again. Because we thought it was an important issue 42 years ago. And Gore came to us and said, I want to join that hearing. Gore had taken a summer class at Harvard with the guy, I forget his name, California scientist who was kind of the father of climate change in the 70s. And Gore had taken a summer class from him and was very impressed with this notion of climate change. So we did a joint hearing with Mr. Gore's subcommittee. That's probably when he really got hooked on climate change, with that set of hearings. It led to some things like a Nobel Prize, you know, many years later. So, but he was a great chair. That's who you dream of. That's who I dream of, sitting in a chair in Tallahassee. Probably won't happen in my lifetime. If Escamani gets and sits in one of those chairs, that's probably what you'll see.
You know, I think you kind of hit on an important point. This idea of just, you know, talking, right? The discussion, and I think even given, especially today's political climate, this idea of dialogue has completely gone out the window. You know, and like you've mentioned, that's what leads to good scientists. That's what leads to good policy.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we foster more of that? Because to be frank, we go to places like the Spring Summit, and you have a bunch of environmentalists that all agree with each other in the same room. How do we get the type of people in that room to go around to other rooms where people might completely disagree, have those conversations, and maybe or maybe not change people's minds?
Yeah. Well, we've touched on it. You have to keep trying. Like I said, we invited different points of view to that summit. If the state doesn't want to talk to us, there's not much we can do about it.
But do you think it should be our responsibility to go to these different hearings, right, and kind of voice our concerns? Do you think,
it's somebody's responsibility. I personally have lost patience with it because nothing happens at the hearings. On the other hand, I do get, I don't want to trash these people at all, but we had the rights of nature movement, which the legislature eliminated. You're familiar with that story? Well, there was a movement for granting rights to
bodies of water,
bodies of water and so forth. And actually, Orange County passed a rights of nature initiative by 88% or something. Legislature came in and wiped all that off the books. I've talked to a lot of the people involved in them. I was sort of asked to be the bad guy and pick apart their arguments. And some people didn't like that, but I took it seriously. The major problem I had with that was it didn't eliminate existing state law, and you still had to determine what clean was and what harm was. And I would ask the people in that movement, I'd say, okay, this body of water has a right. Does it have a right to be 0 parts per million, 0.35 parts? And we already have a standard for clean. In the case of nitrate, it's 0.35. And they never had any standard, so I didn't know how it would work. I didn't have an objection to the concept. I didn't know how it would work. Now we have this constitutional amendment notion. Floridians have a right to clean water. I kind of have the same issues of, well, what does that mean? The state will, if that goes to court sometime, the state's going to say, we agree, we have a right to clean water, and clean water is 0.35 parts nitrogen, this much oxygen, this much whatever, and that's how we define clean water. Well, okay, I think that's a pretty good argument. So now you have something in the Constitution that says citizens have a right to clean water. Well, what level? What is that? I don't get it. So, there's a lot of lawyers working. I know they had a team of lawyers looking at the constitutionality of that, but I'd be curious sort of how it sorts out scientifically. But anyway, I get frustrated because some of the people that are involved in that talk to me and they say, well, we got to try this, nothing else has worked. And so there are a lot of people who are just frustrated with trying to change the system in the normal pathways of going to Tallahassee, testifying, working on political campaigns, going to churches, all that. They're done with that, nothing's worked. Well, I would point out that there's never been a BMAP suit in the history of the state of Florida. We are bringing the first BMAP suit ever. That's the primary mechanism for water quality in the state of Florida, and it's never been challenged in court ever. So I don't think you can say we've tried everything, because it's never been tried. Okay, but I understand that frustration, because I'm not totally done with Tallahassee, but I would have to find people like Escamani that actually have some guts and are willing to try something serious and not just go through the kabuki dance and have a hearing and everybody says everything's fine and then we go home. I don't think there's any point to that. So, yeah, you just have to keep plugging away. And you're right about the dialogue. I think there's a lot of people. I point to Bob Knight. I think Knight does a lot of the dialoguing with scientists in the districts, in DEP and elsewhere, and I give him credit for that. And I think a lot of the environmental scientists do try to do that. But unfortunately, it never reaches the public eye because I don't think they're allowed to let it reach the public eye, which is very frustrating. And nobody in Tallahassee will convene meetings and hearings where the public actually gets to see a real discussion.
And and then you've kind of touched upon this throughout the interview, but we've the picture gets pretty dark. If you kind of look at the facts sometimes, right? But there is elements of hope with the loss you just mentioned, with the BMAP, with the fact that things have gotten better to certain degrees, right? Some things aren't as horrible as they were 30 years ago. Let's be honest. But what other kind of glimmers of hope do you see in the future?
Well, I mentioned Casey earlier as president,
yeah.
FSC. Casey has a little boat over at his house, and we tooled down the Crystal River recently. It looks fabulous, We tooled down the Rainbow River. It really looks good. The vegetation's very good. Crystal River was very problematical recently, but boy, there's enough grasses in there to feed every manatee in Florida, I think. It's spectacular. All the way down the river, just nothing but beautiful grasses. So I think a lot of the local people who had that project of sucking out the muck and replanting take a lot of credit for that, and probably rightly so. I don't know what's the full basis for the recovery. I'm sure that's a significant part of it. The other part, I think, is just we've got a lot of rain. And the flows are up, and the flows are washing that crap out of there. So that's really encouraging, to the extent that individuals and groups there in the river have really helped expedite that. That's really a good sign. Rainbow, you've got the Rainbow River Conservation Inc., I think is one of the very best active springs groups in the state. I mean, one of the top 2 or 3, certainly. They're fabulous. They've got a director, Bert Eno, who's the best. And they've done so much over there, and the rainbow looks really good. So, yeah, there are some glimmers out there. I got to think with, all the education that's going on, the Gainesville Sun's been running these, issues basically on Sunday in their issues section, almost a full section on Sundays, just dealing with springs issues. And I know their editor over there is saying we want solutions. We're tired of the same old whining. Give us some copy on solutions. So that's good. And we do have some reporters. Unfortunately, the number of environmental reporters is not great anymore, but there's still some active ones who do really good work.
Well, I was just asked to serve on the editorial advisory board as the environmental kind of consultant. So
who is?
I am.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So,
excellent. Yeah.
Hopefully, I plan. That's part of what I want to do with this project. Is that I plan on doing some op-eds for the Gainesville Sun.
Oh, excellent.
Every time. So that's also what these interviews are going to be a part of.
One of the things we'll be writing, and it'd be Brian or me or both of us, I'm not sure, but and it's kind of a glimmer of hope, something you'd be interested in. But we're suing on the BMAPs, and so we thought, well, could we write a BMAP? Could we write a legally compliant, effective BMAP? Because it is hard. You're gonna step on some toes if you do this. So we had this concept of a better BMAP, and we picked the Santa Fe River BMAP. And so we wrote a real BMAP that will step on a lot of toes, but I think would result in a effective BMAP. And once the editing on that is done, which is probably going to be June, we'll write an op-ed or 2 on that and put it in the Gainesville Sun and the state's. So I guess that's kind of a glimmer of hope. Here's the state's BMAP. It doesn't work. Here's how you'd actually write one that would work. So it was hard. It was hard. It took a lot of time and took a lot of scientific analysis and additional legal analysis. Not easy. But anyway, that's. I think things like that, things like these policy studies are important to show that there are paths for doing things differently that will be effective.
And I guess the last question to ask you is, to anybody that's listening, to the audience, what kind of last words of wisdom do you have? Kind of what do you want the audience to
I don't have any words of wisdom. What do you mean last? That implies I've had some. Keep a smile on your face. That's my last words of wisdom. If you're going to keep fighting, you gotta have a sense of humor, and you got to put everything in perspective, and you got to be able to laugh at yourself as well as others.
Fair enough. All right, I think that concludes the interview. Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate it, Dr. Palmer.
My
Thank you.
pleasure. Good to meet you both.
Likewise.